Hello and welcome to Season 3, Episode 11 of Logicast, the AWS News podcast brought to you by Logicata. I'm Karl Robinson, CEO and co-founder of Logicata, and I'm joined today by my very special guest, Jon Goodall. How are you doing today, Jon?
You're going to screw up the AI transcription calling me a guest. You're going to have to call me by my title so the transcription gets it right.
I'm just mixing things up a bit because I know you're waiting for me to say as always, and whenever I don't say it, it throws you.
Oh dear. No, I was playing over the weekend. I had a few hours to kill and I was playing with Transcribe and Bedrock, Claude on top of Bedrock, trying to get the transcriptions working. And if you don't introduce people consistently, sometimes it's got my job title in it when you use it. Sometimes it just says a colleague of Karl, Jon Goodall. Like, okay, cool, thanks. My prompts need work.
So in order to get AI to work, I'm going to have to be consistent. Is that what you're saying? I'm going to have to script this. Okay. Pressure, no pressure. Anyway, we're also joined today by a very special guest, Danielle Heberling. Danielle, you are an AWS Serverless Hero, and welcome back to the podcast because this is not your first rodeo with us, is it?
Hey, everyone. Glad to be back. Yeah, I'm glad I didn't say anything offensive last time. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, Karl's the offensive one. It's fine.
So how is life as a serverless hero? Because I think when we spoke with you before, you were a community builder, and then you took on the extra role of AWS Serverless Hero. So how's that changed life for you?
Yeah, it was actually pretty close to this being a guest on this podcast. So I don't know. Maybe it's because of going on this podcast. I'm not going to say yes or no. But yeah, life has been great, mostly doing my same old shenanigans. But it's really great to be recognized by AWS. And it's an honor to be up there with so many other great folks.
Yeah, well, you're not the only hero that's been launched by the podcast. We've also had Johannes come on as a community builder and then become a hero. So if you're a community builder and you're aspiring to become a hero, coming on our podcast probably is not going to hurt.
We can't guarantee it'll help, but it won't hurt.
No guarantees, but I'm just saying it won't hurt to have that.
I'm liking these boomerang guests too. You're the fourth second go round we've had, which is cool.
Yep, absolutely. We're obviously doing something right if people are happy to come back again and join us. So that's great. But great to have you back again, Danielle. As regular listeners to the podcast will know, once a week I curate a list of AWS news, which I share via my weekly AWS News Roundup newsletter. And then Jon and I pick a subset of the articles from the newsletter that we'd like to talk about in a little bit more detail with our guest. So we have a set of articles that we'd like to talk about this week with Jon and Danielle. And the first one is from the AWS security blog. And the title is Introducing the AWS WAF Traffic Overview Dashboard. And I did actually read this one in quite a bit of detail myself because I know that this is something that we could use. And in fact, I would like to think that we are using it because WAF investigations is something we do on a regular basis for our customers when we see unusual traffic patterns, etc. So, Jon, what can you tell us about this? What has improved with the WAF traffic dashboards?
It exists.
Ooh.
It didn't exist before, so that's the improvement. For the listeners' benefit, I have a cold, and I'm not going to go on about it, but I have a cold, so I sound like I've been out drinking. I haven't, I promise.
Maybe you should. Might kill the germs.
I shall break the mead open as soon as we get finished here, and I shall just get smashed on honey. It'd be great fun.
Don't forget, it's Monday. It's Monday, Jon.
So. Yeah. So what's new? Well, the dashboard exists, so that's the improvement. Up until when this was released at the start of the month, it didn't exist, and this is definitely a thing that's hurt us personally before, because doing investigations without this kind of graphical interface, it's possible because you can query the logs into Athena and kind of that sort of thing, but it's difficult because you have to know your way around Athena, and that's not hard, but you have to learn how to do it. B, you kind of have to know how to write SQL, which is, I don't know, it's not a universal skill. I think it should be for engineers and engineering types. It should be a universal skill, but it's not. So that's the other kind of element. This kind of takes that pain and takes it away. We've built things like this before in third-party tools. So Datadog, for one, we've got a notebook in there that we've got in place for a couple of customers. But then you're paying for an external tool, you're ingesting data somewhere else, there's more cost, there's more aggro. It's generally a pain in the backside. This is great because it's there, it's done, it's out the box, brilliant. And what's it showing you? Well, it's showing you stuff that you actually need to care about. It's where's your traffic coming from? What devices is it coming from? Because if you normally see lots of traffic from mobile devices and then all of a sudden your biggest traffic source is a desktop, odds are it's not a desktop, it's a server, and you've got a problem because there's this big swing of where traffic has been and now where it's coming from. And again, with the countries, if you're based in the US or the UK and you expect most of your traffic to come from the US or the UK, and then all of a sudden you've got lots of traffic coming from, I'm trying to say, I want to say some countries, and you know the countries I want to talk about, but I don't want to say it because I don't want to get banned. No, I'm not going to pick the countries, but you know, malicious bad state actors. There we go. Let's
countries where you would not be expecting visitors to your website.
Basically, yeah. If you get traffic coming from sort of weird places, then again, it's an indicator that you've got a problem. And then there's, the old-fashioned stuff like bots and types of exploits that people are trying and that kind of thing. And it's just great because it's doing all of this for you out of the box. You haven't had to do it. You haven't had to go off and build it. It's just there. So turn on WAF v2 because WAF v1, WAF Classic still exists. Nobody should be using it anymore. You should all just be using v2 now because it's been around for so long. And just go nuts. It's brilliant. It's great. So long as you get your alerts in place, and their CloudWatch alerts are not brilliant, in my opinion. They're a bit finicky to get right, but this is brilliant. No complaints about this at all.
What about your thoughts on this, Danielle? Relevant in your world?
Yeah, this is definitely relevant in my world. I was actually mostly excited to see that it was just like available by default, because a lot of times AWS will release new things and, for whatever reason, like I'm not meaning this is a huge critique, but like as a user, it's annoying to have to like turn things on, like being able to tag things. But I know they probably have their reasons. It's a complex system. They don't want to break things for people. But that was one thing that really stuck out for me. And just thinking all the times of, working for a SaaS company and customers write in saying they can't access. And it's like, it takes a while for us to realize like, oh, wait, maybe it's the WAF blocking this. So like just having a much nicer visualization and all that, so you can fine tune your, different rules and control groups that you have, because WAF can get complicated real fast. So I'm pretty excited about this.
And not only is it available by default, but it's also free, which is nice.
Well, I think the point is the data was already there. You had to work very hard to get it, and now they've just surfaced it automatically. So, lots of thumbs up. I don't have the reactions turned on, so I can't put them on feed, but lots of thumbs up.
So what about this comparison with CloudFront security dashboard, though, towards the end of the article? I don't know if you got that far, John, but it's some...
well, they're kind of doing different things. CloudFront has kind of some very basic access controls baked into it. You can just geo stuff, to the point around countries earlier. You can kind of flip things on its head and say, I am only expecting and therefore only allowing traffic from these sets of countries, or I'm explicitly blocking from every edge location all of these, which means your WAF costs potentially go down a little bit because it's not inspecting the traffic. I don't think there's a real comparison. It's an apples to apples comparison, but you're comparing a cooking apple to an eating apple. It's technically they're the same fruit, but one goes in a crumble and one goes in your lunchbox.
And if you put the wrong one in your lunchbox, it's not a very pleasant experience.
I wouldn't eat a cooking apple, no.
Not intentionally, no. Not prior to it being cooked. Anyway, that's we definitely digress from the world of WAF into lunchboxes. So on that note, let's move on to the next article for this week, which is from the AWS Containers blog. I think this might be our first ever article from the Containers blog that we've talked about on cast. I'd have to double check my facts there, but I think it may well be. And this article is all about Windows authentication with gMSA on Linux containers. on Amazon ECS with AWS Fargate. And I know you've picked this, Jon, because you're a serverless community builder and Danielle is a serverless hero. And this was the closest article we had to anything kind of serverless that we could talk about on the podcast this week. So let's talk about Windows authentication on containers. Woo!
I mean, I picked it for that and for the fact that it's got a really big diagram in it. And I know how much you like picking whether the icons are correct or not. I know that's a thing for you.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that EC2 one there. That maybe looks a little bit legacy.
Oh, dear. So, all right, let's do a few definitions for the listeners. I don't know why I said it like that. Whatever. We'll do a few definitions for the listeners, and then we'll go from there. So, why is this important? Why would you care? So, gMSA, I have no idea what it stands for, but the short version is there is a way of doing Windows authentication in Linux, so you can then, from your Linux environment, access Windows authenticated resources. The obvious one being something like SQL Server, because SQL Server runs on Windows. You can, so in RDS land, you don't tend to by default, but you can use Windows Auth to access your SQL Server. And I've done that before in kind of on-prem environments when I was working in banking and those kind of things. It was domain joined, it was Windows Auth, and that's kind of how it all worked. You didn't have a username and password. You did, but it was your Windows one, and it was all kind of hooked up like that. When you want to move from your legacy setup, Windows servers, Windows environment, to, say, a containerized environment, you can do Windows containers, but I think they probably still can only run on Windows hosts, and that becomes quite awkward. So you want to run on Linux as much as possible because it gives you more flexibility, but you still need to be able to do Windows Auth. That's kind of what this is doing. And now you can do it in Fargate. Brilliant. There's a lot of definitions there.
gMSA, I believe, stands for Group Managed Service Accounts.
Well, that would make sense.
Yeah. Anything to add on this one, Danielle?
I feel like I learned a lot from this article. Honestly, it was a little over my head. And I'm not sure I'm exactly the target audience for this, but I could see how, it might be helpful to certain individuals, similar to like what Jon said. One thing I will say, though, is I do kind of loosely have one foot in the Office 365 world, just like with working in healthcare. But yeah, for our Fargate stuff, we use the IAM, like the roles. But yeah, I'm trying to think what else. Oh yeah, one other thing to note, I really like that they included a CDK sample, because a lot of times AWS will be like, use infrastructure as code, use infrastructure as code. But then they do an announcement blog like this that's like, you can easily set this up in the console. So this was a very nice departure from that. Kudos to them for the infrastructure as code sample.
I think there's a reason behind that, though, because new services, and I don't know if this is new or just an expansion, they have this odd criteria where it has to be accessible from the console and the CLI, but no API, no CloudFormation and CDK, or standard CloudFormation. So it's one of those, this is kind of the minimum, and consultants that I know and have worked with and stuff have been railing against this for years to say, please give me day one CloudFormation support, please. So that might be why. But yeah, nice departure from that for a change.
And it is new. It's the availability of credentials fetcher integration is what this article is announcing. So that's the new part. Anyway, let's move along to the next article for this week. And this one is from the AWS Integration and Automation blog. And the title is Reduce Project Delays with a Docs as Code Solution. We all know that engineers and developers love documentation. It's their favorite part of their job. I'm not an engineer or a developer, but I do hear engineers and developers complaining an awful lot about having to do documentation. So it would seem that there is documentation can be automated. So Danielle, I'm going to come to you first on this one, just for your view on this. But first of all, how about just give us your view on documentation as a whole? Do you have documentation?
Well, honestly, I'm a little of a weird developer in this regard because I come from like a non-traditional background. I did tech support and teaching, so like I love to teach things to people, and a lot of times, like as I am coding things, maybe it's just because I prefer like a more asynchronous type of workflow. I generally make documentation as part of my workflow. So then if someone's like, hey, Danielle, how does this thing that you built work? I can just be like, bam, Confluence link.
Yeah, nice.
But I admit that's a little more the exception, probably.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that approach. It sounds like a great
Let me
approach
introduce you to our CTO.
He's going to love you.
Yeah, I'm the other way. It's not that I don't like documentation; I just hate writing it. It's ironic because I love blogging, I love writing, I do community events, teaching is great. I love doing all of that. When I'm writing code, my brain is in one sort of mode. So if I were to write documentation in that kind of mode, it would make no sense to anyone other than me, which is then not very useful. The problem I have with this article, though, is it's calling it documentation as code, and it's not. It's not.
Okay.
The idea that they're kind of coming away from here is that, and this is not true for small teams, because small teams developers write their own documentation because you kind of have to. The idea here is much more at an AWS scale, where they've built a new feature, a load of engineers have gone off and built it, and they've written engineering docs, probably. Brilliant. And then you've got this other kind of user documentation side of things that's all done by more technical writers. And there was this historic great big silo between them where you'd be building all the systems and building it, it'll be ready to go, but your technical writers haven't finished, and that they're not using things like source control and proper versioning control practices. It's all still done in OneDrive and Word documents and all the rest of it. So it's not as code as such, or it's code as much as Markdown and ASCII doc can be considered code. It's like it's code light. It's basically, it's a few tags and things around it. But it's basically saying that rather than having this big divide between engineers and people that write documentation, everybody lives and works together. Everybody lives and works in the same repo, so that your documentation, be that engineering and internal or user and external, kind of all lives together. So you push an update, your docs get pushed, everything gets pushed in the same place. And then, okay, they're taking that ASCII doc and turning it into a pretty web page. So it's docs as code, but it's code light, if you like. You're not writing a load of Python to create documentation. It's not like old-fashioned Java doc where the Java doc program is actually reading your Java to generate the documentation for you. It's not that. You're still writing the bulk of it, but you're getting this nice pretty website out of your ASCII doc.
So it's just a different way of presenting your documentation. It's not creating your documentation for you. Is that what you're saying?
Effectively, yeah. And more to the point, it's saying that all work to do with your software, solution and how you're shipping, should be version controlled. Which is hard to argue with that, really.
Yeah. How do you do your documentation, Danielle? Do you do it all manually? Do you have any automation solutions for that?
Well, my day job, we love Jira and Confluence. Yeah. So we do a lot of Confluence stuff. Sometimes we will put things like in a README file, but yeah, for the most part, it's like, see this link in Confluence. But yeah, that's like kind of always an issue that I've noticed anywhere is like you have stuff all over the place and it's like, I just want to go to one spot to find my things. But that's kind of another issue that this isn't really addressing. But it's definitely addressing issues. I thought it was kind of interesting to just see how AWS thinks about this. I don't think that really directly affects me or how I do things. I actually had to read it a few times to kind of understand what the solution was, because it's a problem I've never run into, because I've always worked at places where it's like you build it, you document it. So
it's very much for things. It's an AWS type problem, I think. And obviously they're not the only people that have to do this, but it's not for anything engineering focused or internal documentation. I feel it's very much for here's a service, here's a SaaS service, for instance, that we've built. Here's how you as the user consume it. And here's a nice way of producing that documentation.
So not something either of you are going to be jumping on anytime soon to change your way of working.
I mean, I use Markdown for my documentation, but that's just an effect of where it lives.
Yeah. Fair enough. Okay, let's move on from documentation onto more free stuff. So if you do read the IT press, you won't have missed the announcement in the last week that AWS has followed the recent announcement from Google and have announced that data transfer out to the internet when leaving AWS will now be free of charge. In a way, it's great, but unless you're planning on leaving, you're not going to get anything for free. But what do we think about this one, Danielle? I know you were keen to talk about this one. So what are your thoughts on this? Is this just kind of virtue signaling because of what Google has done, or is there something more behind it, do you think?
Yeah, this is like my very biased take. So like, I'm not speaking for anyone else when I say this, but when I read this, I was like, great, awesome. This will be good for lots of folks. But also I kind of read it more as like a PR spin on, look, we have to follow this European Data Act rule. We're going to spin this as like, we care about customer choice because it's a convenient thing we could throw in here. But yeah, it felt like a little, personally, I felt like it would have been a little more tasteful to just be like, hey, we have to follow these rules. FYI, here it is. Get rid of the fluff was kind of my opinion.
Yeah.
And this is why engineers don't work in marketing.
So, John, I know you will have read the European Data Act because you're that.
I haven't actually. I haven't.
Really? Oh,
I know. I got so bored of everything coming out of the European Parliament that I gave up.
That must be the only bit of legislation that you haven't read.
For the listeners' benefit, I have read the GDPR full text, cover to cover, and quite a lot of UK employment law, which makes Karl's life quite hard.
I just refer it to HR.
Brilliant. Okay. I mean, for me, this is performatism. Fundamentally, it's performatism. Google came first. There's some legislation that says they have to do it. I don't know how far that legislation actually goes, and I might have to go and read it now. But it's one of those. It's performatism. I think the way I kind of viewed this when I was first reading it, thinking about it over the weekend because I'm dull, was most pricing is based on in the cloud. It's cost plus pricing. It costs us this much to run the service, therefore we're going to charge you that plus a markup. Egress fees is not cost plus. It's value based because the argument is if it was cost plus, they'd charge you equally for inbound and outbound. And okay, you probably have a lot less inbound than you do outbound, but they'd charge you for it. And they don't. They don't charge you anything for ingress, and they charge you a load for egress. So what they're saying is, well, you're no longer going to get any value from our service because you're leaving. So just, clear off. But there's legislative reasons behind it, and I can't think that they'd have done it if they weren't forced to. But realistically, what I'd like to see, rather than, if you're leaving AWS, submit a support ticket, we'll comp the fees for egress. Whoopie-doo. If people are actually considering leaving AWS, it's not because of egress fees. And, it wouldn't stop them from leaving, I don't think. What I'd really like to see is a top-down review of egress fees as a whole, because 9 cents a gigabyte is just atrocious.
Yeah, well, I think that might be coming with all of the various. I mean, I haven't read the European Data Act either, but I've read lots of articles about the Competition and Markets Authority probes of the major cloud providers in the UK. And I know egress fees is one of the big things that keeps coming up time and time again.
That's because it's a thing that auditors can understand.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I read another article. It doesn't get mentioned here because obviously it's on the AWS blog, but I did read another article comparing Google, AWS, and Microsoft. And Microsoft have not made any announcements around this particular issue yet. So it'd be interesting to see what they do next, whether things are different for them, whether they're going to follow the same route or not, or whether they're just going to, not make a big song and dance about it like Google and AWS have done, and just follow the legislation quietly. But certainly be interesting to see how that.
When have Microsoft ever done anything quietly? I still remember that Windows launch thing they did where they had the party and all the awkward dad dancing on stage. That was horrific.
Yeah, what was his name? Steve
Ballmer.
yeah,
Ballmer, however you pronounce it.
yeah,
Yeah. It was
yeah.
awful.
Farmer. Yeah. There's a lot of good memes of that going around, him sweating. But yeah, I can't see this announcement being quite that exciting when it does get made. But nice to see nonetheless. So let's move on then to our final article this week, which is a slight departure from the day-to-day use of tech. This one back on the subject of power. We've spoken about power and sustainable power on the podcast a number of times. And this particular article is all about Amazon's acquisition of a nuclear-powered data center in Pennsylvania. So usually when we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about wind and solar and so on and so forth. But this one's about a new nuclear-powered data center that Amazon are acquiring. So what are your thoughts on this one, John?
Got your tin foil ready. The conspiracy theorists are going to come out of the woodwork on this. It's a funny one. The Green Lobby, and how can I word this? I care because, you're an idiot not to, but I'm not an environmentalist. I don't, spend all day thinking about it. I don't go to protests. I don't glue myself to pavements. I'm not an environmentalist, but I care because I'd like to be able to, breathe air and keep living and have trees, that kind of thing. The Green Lobby generally, certainly in the UK, I don't know about other places, have been quite anti-nuclear historically because of the fissionable waste and all this and all that, to the extent where in certain parts of Europe, maybe Germany, I'm not sure, they've ended up shutting down loads of nuclear power stations, mothballing them, just killing them off completely. And what have they done instead? Well, they've burnt coal. That's brilliant. Okay, that's counterproductive to the point where it's actually more ecologically sensible to buy a diesel car than it is to buy an electric one because of how dirty the electricity is, which is just brilliant. But yeah, Green Lobby aside, because of this kind of non-nuclear vibe, because you say nuclear power station, where do people think? They go Chernobyl, they go Fukushima, they go 3 Mile Island, and that's all 3 nuclear disasters that we're aware of. How many people have been, what's the early mortality rate because of burning coal and that kind of thing? It's ridiculous. But yeah, it's conspiracy theorists are going to come out of the woodwork on this one because of it's nuclear power. Okay, fine. Any power that doesn't come from burning dead dinosaurs is good power in my view. So this is great. I like this. The whole it's nuclear powered is it's kind of a misnomer for me because, okay, the data center is powered officially by the nuclear power station that's kind of nearby, but that goes into the grid and then they're buying it from them. So it's all kind of being powered by the grid anyway. They've not trenched some lines specifically under the coolant stacks to go and get their power through the back door. It's just, okay, cool, we've got more renewables. Nuclear is sort of semi-renewable because uranium isn't renewable, but, about this much is about the same as 250,000 metric tons of coal. Brilliant. So yeah, I like this generally. I've always been a fan of nuclear power anyway, and any data centers that don't take dead dinosaurs for power is good in my view.
What are your thoughts? Nuclear power, Danielle? Are you a fan?
Yeah, this one was interesting for me because I live in Oregon now, but I actually grew up in Pennsylvania. So super curious to see where this was. And I Googled it, and it's 100 miles from 3 Mile Island, which is fascinating. But yeah, one thing that I will mention about 3 Mile Island is there was a real fantastic documentary about it on Netflix, at least in the States, which was super interesting. But anyway, yeah, overall, I feel like I'm pretty bullish on nuclear power, but like anything, there's always trade-offs. I think in particular, the disposal of the waste is going to be an issue. I'm trying to think what else. Yeah, stuff like the Fukushima, make sure it's somewhere where there's not going to be an earthquake, things like that. But overall, I think day to day, using nuclear to me feels much cleaner than burning coal. And I feel pretty pretty positive about it, honestly, as long as it's, you're responsible about it. I think nuclear has kind of gotten some bad rap of, to Jon's point, it's like there were 3 real major meltdowns, and that's kind of what everyone associates nuclear with. And honestly, I think it's pretty impressive that there's only 3 that people can point to. But again,
and one of them was in the Soviet Union in the 80s. Like, it was a very long time ago now.
I mean, I do understand some people's concerns surrounding, like certain governments, the US government included, like kind of being a little weird about people that live near these plants, not, being fully forthright about some of the dangers. But, that's not my job. But yeah, I totally get that. But yeah, I'm pretty pro this. And I think especially, with AI, there's going to be a lot more pull on compute, and we've got to find data sources somehow. So
yeah, I think the article mentioned a statistic that may well have been made up, but I think
well, 97% of statistics are.
Yeah, so I'm gonna have to look it up. So I can't find it in the article, but I think it said something like AI is going to increase data center power demand by 50% in the coming years. Did you guys spot that? I mean, that seems
yeah, I could see it there. Expected to drive a 50% increase in energy demand over the next 3 years.
Yeah, that's
wow,
huge. That is really huge. And it's got to come from somewhere. And in my view, nuclear seems more efficient than all the other sustainable sources. Building windmills, a lifespan and need to be disposed of. Solar panels.
Well, yes and no. Yes and no.
Yeah.
Yes and no. So the lifespan of something like a solar panel, and I love solar. I have it on my roof. I have batteries in my house. It's a big fan. The lifespan of a solar panel, the working lifespan, is something like 50 years. The efficiency of them drops, not particularly sharply, but it drops after about 20 to 30 years. And there's this kind of gradual degradation. Okay. They've got rare earth elements in them, and they're basically impossible to recycle. But I imagine in 50 years' time that should have changed, hopefully. The lifespan of a commercial wind turbine, and I don't mean like the little spinny ones you can put on your house. I mean the big ones that if it hit you, you'd be flying for 4 miles. The lifespan of those is something like 25 to 30 years. But we've spoken about this on the pod before. The turbine blades, they're rated for something like 25 years because of the sheer amount of force they're under. And there have been people working on ways you can then repurpose these things into things like footbridges and cool stuff like that, because they're still really big, strong lumps of metal, but you just can't put them under that level of centrifugal, I don't know how you pronounce that, that level of force for that length of time and not expect some sort of metal fatigue. And you don't want one of those flying off at 100 miles an hour. Cool. Now, the lifespan of a nuclear power plant, at least in the UK, is about 40 years, believe it or not. It's not actually that dissimilar. There's one I went to as a kid up in Cumbria, in kind of northern UK, not quite, northern England, not quite Scotland, that kind of area. And they were just, they kind of decommissioned it when I was there, and this was 20 years ago now. And it was sort of a semi-working museum. So you'd wander around, and that's where I get my stats about things like uranium, because they had a little bit of uranium, actually uranium, might have been real uranium, in a display case. And here's how much coal it would be. It was about this big. And I remember that because it was fun, and I was 9, and it was great. But the lifespan of a nuclear power station is about the same as the lifespan of the other renewables. The primary difference with nuclear compared with renewables is it's much more consistent, which is what our power grids are set up to deal with. They're set up to deal with big, obvious, consistent generation and then flexible demand, which is how you'd see. It's like the half time at the football match. Everyone turns the kettle on. Quick, we need to turn on a gas power station. We need to bring some hydro power in because we can turn it on and off quite quickly. General renewables are quite bad at that because the wind blows when it blows, the sun's out when it's out. Neither of those things happen brilliantly at night most of the time. Okay, and that's where you get the stories of them having to turn off turbines because we've got too much power, we can't do anything with it. So primarily, it's not the generation that's the problem, it's the storage. And nuclear solves for that because it's consistent. So it's a much better way of dealing with the old-fashioned problem of we can't keep it.
So nuclear power to support our AI large language models. It sounds like
what could possibly go wrong?
All agreeing on. Absolutely. I don't know. Just ask AI. I'm sure it'll tell you. Well, on that note, we have reached the end of our time. Season 3, episode 11 of Logicast. So I'd just like to thank you, Jon, as always, for your insights. And Danielle, thank you very much for coming on as a guest for a second time and sharing your insights with us as well. It's been great to have you on again. Thank you for listening. As always, if you enjoyed it, tell your friends. You can download us wherever you download your podcasts. If you'd like to look at us while we're speaking to you, you can also find us on YouTube. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week with another guest to take a deep dive into the AWS news. We'll see you again next time. Cheers.